Try to squeeze in that frame.
All right, so we're going to have to use a little different camera. All right, let's broadcast.
Technical difficulty.
Well, good evening, folks, and welcome. Sorry for the delayed start, but we were having a little difficulty with the camera, so we had to switch cameras here. Tonight, we are going to be talking about Joseph and the amazing dream code. And have any of you seen the play? You know, Joseph and the Amazing Dream Code. Have you seen that, Benji?
I've seen the Disney movie. I don't think I've seen the play.
Was the Disney movie a cartoon? Or was it?
It was a cartoon.
Yeah,
it was pretty good.
Yeah.
I didn't know they did a cartoon. Have you seen the play?
No, I haven't seen the play.
Oh, you haven't? Oh, well, it's kind of a wacky thing. You know, Pharaoh is Elvis. You know, so he's the king, and so it is. You know, Sir Lloyd Webber, is he the one that wrote that play?
Andrew Lloyd Webber. I don't know
Andrew
for sure which who did, but yeah.
As I recall, he wrote that when he was a teenager. But anyway, it's,
They take some. Let's just say it's translated loosely from the Bible to the Broadway, which is an excellent play. It's a wonderful Broadway play. So.
yeah, that's right. Well, I am going to share the screen now, and I'm going to open up, close this out, and close this out. I'm going to open up our scripture here. With you know, the Joseph story is fairly lengthy. It goes through several chapters in the book of Genesis. Needless to say, we're not going to be able to get through the entire story tonight. But I think we'll hit some pretty good points. So why don't we start at the very beginning of chapter 37 and set the stage for what Joseph is all about. So what we see on the screen here is the first 11 verses in chapter 37. Benji, are you up to reading those?
Let me try without my glasses. Jacob lived in the land where his fathers had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending to the flocks with his brothers. The sons of Bilhah, Zilpah, and the sons of Zulapah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father, as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind.
All right. Thanks, Benji. So anyway, so here's Joseph, and his brothers are furious, and they hate him. Can you understand why?
Oh, yes. Definitely.
Why?
I mean, we all have those moments where we dislike our siblings because they think they're better than us. And if Joseph wasn't wanting to convey that message, he did a bad job because he definitely did.
Yeah.
So I mean, out of it, maybe not like upset, but like definitely like this guy is definitely like thinks highly of himself. If not, because I can have that dream. I'm not necessarily gonna go tell my siblings about it. I don't know.
Well, it would appear that way, but you know, he was a favorite of his father's as well. Why do you suppose that was?
Well, he was one of the younger ones. I don't think he wasn't the youngest one. And there were a lot of sons, so I think sometimes as parents, whether we ever verbalize it or not, we probably can relate easier. We probably relate differently to our children because our kids are different, and we may have a favorite, but hopefully we don't. I mean, and I'm not saying that maybe we don't, but because we relate differently to our children because our children are all different. But there are probably some, there's a lot of kids in the family that, there's probably going to be kids that are easier than other siblings. So.
I have the feeling here in studying this and reading this, and I know I'm speculating here, but it's my thought that his father sees something very special in this young man. I mean, I've known people at a very young age that are exceptional. They're just exceptional people. And I suspect that Joseph, even as a youngster, was very exceptional. I mean, we haven't studied David here, but David, as a young man, was very exceptional.
Who became King David.
That's right.
He was very exceptional.
And so, I suspect that that's part of it too. He's a very exceptional young man. And I think that's one of the reasons his brothers resent him, because the brothers see him as kind of better than them.
They feel threatened. They feel threatened.
Yeah.
They feel threatened, yeah.
I mean, I'm sure Jacob is the same person as Israel. Jacob and Israel, they're the same people in the scripture passage that we just read. Right. Joseph's father, his name's Jacob and Israel. So I'm sure he loved his other sons, and this is speculation. But for some reason, Jim, there was something about Joseph that was special. And not that there wasn't special things about his other kids, but for some reason.
Well, it does say, was he not the youngest? I thought
No.
he was.
Benjamin.
Well, but he comes later. Like,
Yeah.
he's not
He
here
might
yet.
be younger. He might be the youngest now.
Well,
in the story.
yeah, so
But
he
Benjamin might have been born later. You're
Yeah.
right.
So, like, in this moment, he is the
Yeah, there
youngest,
you go. Yeah.
which means, and it does say he loved him because he had come to him at old age.
Yeah.
So there was something special about Joseph. Yeah, he wasn't the youngest in the story, but Benjamin comes later. And if you guys remember, like, we'll see that later, but Benjamin becomes the favorite being the youngest. So
Yeah.
there is that. And it is kind of like like socially known that the youngest is the most spoiled, maybe. Like
There
in
you
our-
go.
Yeah.
It's a birth,
You
it's
went
a
ahead and
birth
said it.
order.
Yeah.
That's a birth order.
in our culture, it's kind of
You're
not-
right.
not PC to say that he's the favorite or more loved, but he usually we, because I'm the youngest too, we're more favored in some aspects. I don't know. So
Well, parents like with their firstborn, it's like, oh my gosh, it's something's going to happen, to this child. Yeah, we have to get used to that as parents, and and then but by the time later ones come on, it's all right. We got this down, and then sometimes you relax a little bit, and so you're not quite the disciplinarian that you would be with.
so spoiled is the word I would use. I was spoiled, not more loved, but spoiled. So maybe
Yeah.
Joseph was spoiled.
Sure. Well, being the youngest at the time, yeah. So.
He got a fancy robe.
I have to defend Joseph on expressing his dreams to his brothers, because he had these dreams, and he was a dreamer, and these dreams that he had were very powerful.
More real. I mean,
They were very real to him. So I think all he was doing with his brothers was saying, "Hey, I had this dream," and I mean, the dream was very prophetic. They saw that, but they saw it more as speculative than prophecy. But,
yeah, I don't know. I don't know whether he said, "Hey, you listen." I don't know. You can we
tone.
can yeah. We don't know his tone. His tone. He's like, "You all listen to this dream because this is the dream that I mean." I would say that it's like, "Hey, I had this dream, and this is what the dream means." So it all depends upon the tone that he took. Sit down here, brothers, because I'm going to share you with you my dream. I don't know whether I don't think if I had to speculate about it, what do you think?
Maybe he was a little more inquisitive, wanting to know his brother's opinion of the
Yeah.
dream.
So what do you think about
He wasn't rubbing it in their face
Yeah,
necessarily.
I wonder. I wonder whether he was. I mean, whether he was just, hey, this is the dream I had, not like, hey, this is all about me. This is me. This is me here. I don't know whether he.
Yeah, maybe it was a matter of reading the room because he's probably intelligent enough to know that already as it was. His brothers weren't quite happy with him, and then to come and say this, I don't know.
Well, you're right. I mean, the scripture does say that he is the favored because he came to Jacob/Israel in his old age, and so you would think that you would want to downplay it as you share this, because that you're already the favored one, and how do you think you would react if somebody said, "I want to share with you my dreams," and I mean, you're setting yourself up for something.
Yeah.
I mean, you could be.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's fast forward a little bit in the story. So, what happens next is his brothers are out on a work mission. They're out taking care of the sheep and cattle and so forth. So they're off taking care of the ranch, so to speak. And the father hasn't seen him for a while. Jacob/Israel has not seen the older brothers for a while. So he sends Joseph out to check on them. So this is, we're going to take a look at the next part here. I'm going to share the screen again. And we are going to take a look at the next part of the scripture, and that is what happens when Joseph stumbles onto his brother. Takes him a while to find his brothers, but then he stumbles onto them. So this is what happens. So this is fairly lengthy. Ed, do you mind reading this?
Give it a shot.
Okay, go ahead.
All right. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty, there was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard.
Okay, thank you very much. So Joseph is off. Now, here's the thing. His brothers were so blinded by jealousy over Joseph and rage, they failed to recognize his extraordinary talents that he had. You know, I think of a talented young man that I know, and I won't use his name because I don't have his permission, but you know him as well, Reggie. But this young man is very talented, and in high school, he was entrepreneurial. And as a high school student, he made a lot of money because of his business ventures. And he belonged to a church youth group. And I know the youth leaders of that youth group, very nice people. But he went out and bought this expensive car. And he shows up at the youth group in his expensive car. So you can imagine Joseph enraging his brothers, kind of enraged the youth. Hey, look at my cool car. And the youth leaders were so enraged that he did that. They failed to see, in my view, they failed to see his, exceptionalism. And they felt that he was setting a bad example for the youth group. And this young man no longer felt welcome there and actually left the youth group. So, I mean, I could see that happening in real life. When it comes to, I've been thinking a lot about this the last week or so as I've been preparing for this, and there are a lot of exceptional people out there. All you have to do is turn on the TV. And what we're looking at, even on TV, for the most part, is the very best. These are exceptional people. Doesn't necessarily mean they're good. I mean, there are people who are exceptional that are good, and there are people who are exceptional that are very bad. But there are exceptional people. One other thing, in my experience this week, I'm also reading a historical novel about the Revolutionary War. Brand new book, just came out. And I was reading this book this week about Benjamin Franklin. Now, Benjamin Franklin was indentured to his older brother at a very young age. I believe it was like 7 years old. He may have been older than that. But anyway, he was indentured to his older brother in the printing business at a very young age. And when you are indentured, there is actually a written contract. And he was committed by contract to be with his brother until he was 21. So there was going to be many years. May have been 11, so it may have been a 10-year indenture. But at any rate, Benjamin Franklin, even as a very young man working for his brother, was very exceptional. And that was proven because he was writing articles. He wanted to have a regular article in his brother's newspaper, and his brother forbid it. He wouldn't let him do it. So what Benjamin Franklin did, he started writing articles under a surname, under a different name. And that became very popular. His articles became very popular. And his brother was excited because the paper was selling, because people wanted to read about this widow that was very comical and so forth, this particular widow name that he was writing under. And this went on for some time. And then finally, Benjamin Franklin confessed to his brother that, hey, these articles are mine, thinking his brother would be excited, but instead his brother beat him. He was so enraged and he beat him. So Benjamin Franklin ran away. And of course, the rest became history because figure. But it just goes to show how sometimes exceptional people can really be misread and even mistreated. And I just saw that as another example. So,
And I think too, might add that I think the whole jealousy thing. I mean, that was, we talked about that. I mean, his brothers were jealous of him. I think it was when you brought up the screen, the scripture passage that Ed read. Like the first sentence is that here come the brothers are out in the, Joseph's approaching his brothers, and the first, oh, here comes that dreamer. And then they go from here comes that dreamer to let's kill him. I mean, it's like, whoa, were they like out there talking about him, out there as they were tending sheep for their father and for the ranch on the ranch? Were they out there? Yeah, that's just a stark contrast again. Here comes that dreamer, and then it's like, oh, let's get rid of him. It's
Well, and you got to wonder too.
talk about jealousy.
Jacob sent him out there to check on the brothers, which he's the young brother out there checking on his older brothers. So if you're one of the older brothers, you're like, why is this young kid coming out to check on me?
Because it talks about the young boy. The scripture said he was a young boy.
Yeah. So that's almost an insult,
And another thing happens. Mob mentality took over here. I could see where these guys could gym this up to the point where let's kill this kid.
And if they've been talking about him as they're out there, working together because they've been out there working a while and say, well, who is the favorite one? I mean, then you just can't you continue to layer upon layer, and you can't say anything good about
I do want to say though that I think that in the story of Joseph, Reuben doesn't get enough credit. I think he should.
Yeah. Reuben was trying to look out for his baby brother, and they kind of duped him too, didn't they? His older brothers duped him too.
Yeah. All right. So, oops, I'm moving ahead here too much. All right. So here comes the dreamer, and then what happens is I may be missing a section here. I'm missing, section, verse 1. Okay, that's right. So these are the first 7 verses in chapter 39. Joseph, of course, the last scene, he's going off with the Ishmaelites. You can envision him being tied up, dragged along behind, a camel. So he ends up with Potiphar. That's where we left him. He's with Potiphar. So let's see what happens here. The first 7 verses. Pastor Val, do you mind reading these?
No, I would love
verses?
to. So this is Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate.
Can I ask you to stop there for a second? Joseph is a slave. And look what happens. He becomes successful in this house. He has every reason to be angry over what has happened. But look at what he does. He actually becomes, at this point, a servant leader. And that to me is a very amazing transition. I mean, it would seem like any other person would be so angry and rebellious that there would be that Potiphar would have a very difficult time getting him to do anything.
Mhm.
But it's like Joseph takes this on as a new chapter in life,
Mhm.
and he becomes a true servant leader. I mean, he's now the head of this household in Potiphar's absence.
Mhm.
So that's pretty amazing. Do you do you have any thoughts on servant leadership? I'm gonna go back to our screen for a second.
Well, I would concur. You were talking about Joseph being exceptional, and so I think that's right. Now, that's exactly what he's very exceptional to take all this hardship, and I guess he didn't let what happened to him and what his brothers did to him, get in the way of being an instrument of and being a man of faith and being an instrument of faithfulness and using what skills and gifts he had to organize everything in that household to the point where, I mean, Potiphar didn't, the captain of the guard didn't have to worry about anything except the food he ate, so he took care of everything. So talk about exceptional. He's very exceptional. No wonder his brothers didn't like him. It's like he has the Midas touch. Everything he touches turns to gold or something like that. I mean, if you believe that myth.
You have to wonder too, and we talked about some of the other characters we've talked about, what we would ask him if we got to meet them someday in heaven. And I think what I'd like to ask Joseph is when you had those dreams, I would guess that he felt that those dreams came from God,
Mm-hmm.
and that God had a plan for him. And did that help him through this tough time to say, well, this must be part of God's plan. I'm going to do the best I can, trust in God that things are going to work out. And that's what kept him going.
It doesn't necessarily say that in the scripture
No,
passage.
that's
but-
why we
but
have to
you're
ask him to
right.
find out.
That's why I believe he's exceptional. He's faithful.
Mhm.
And I would make that assumption. I would make that, but it takes an exceptional person though to do that.
He's not only exceptional.
He's
but-
young too.
Yes, but he's also a servant.
Mhm.
Let me ask you, Ed, are you a servant leader?
I think so.
Yeah, I think you are too. You're in charge, right?
Mhm.
Certain things in the work world. And how about you, Pastor Bob? Are you a servant leader?
I think I am. I mean, I think the way in which I would talk about a servant leader is that as I lead our church, I don't ask of you anything that I'm not also willing to do. And I never want to set myself up as being better than anybody because I'm not. Absolutely am not. And so I think servant leaders lead by example. And so that means, sometimes, you got to get your hands and feet dirty and, do the things that you might not have thought that you would be needing to do as the leader. I mean,
So does that mean when you dressed up in your costumes for trunk or treat,
Uh-huh.
you're going to expect other people to do it because you've done it?
well, there will be people who will dress up in that old courthouse trunk or treat. Yeah. So, but I think that to me, I mean, it's being able to lead, but with a servant's heart. That which involves. That's the only way I know to lead, to do what needs to be done, and that might mean that you're going to have to sweep the sidewalk or something like that.
Even Jesus got down and washed his disciples' feet. I mean, he showed us the example that sometimes you got to do the things that need to be done,
And
and not be, like you say, not hold yourself above others.
it's all about humility. I mean,
Mhm.
Jesus was a humble servant leader. He was a humble servant leader.
How about you, Benji? You worked in servant leadership positions?
I'd like to think I'm more of a servant than a leader. while still honing my leadership skills.
You bring up an important point. I think choice between the two, servant is probably more important to learn than leadership skills. It was fortunate for me in my career that I was able to work in the hotel industry for so many years with Marriott. And in the hotel, you have to have the attitude of being a servant, because no matter what your position is in that hotel, the guest comes first. And if it means you carry the guest bags to their room or whatever you do, it's all about the guest. And your position has very little to do with that. So a servant leader is always serving somebody. They're either serving the customer or they're serving the people who do serve the customer. And that is what makes the difference in many cases between a successful company and an unsuccessful company, is having that servant leadership culture within a company. And I think Joseph is setting a great example here of being a servant leader. He's a true servant, and he is also the leader of this household. He's respected, he's trusted, he's got great leadership skills. So at this point in his life, life is very good for him. He's in control of the house, things are coming together, he's very well trusted, but then he runs into a problem, and that is Potiphar's, I'm saying this right.
Potiphar's wife.
Potiphar's wife. She is trying to seduce him. And she's working at this day after day after day. And then what happens here, again, to fast forward in the story, is there's one day she catches him alone in the house when all the other servants are gone. And she comes on to him very strong. And again, Joseph sets a very good example for us. When I used to teach the 7th, 8th grade Sunday school class, I used to use this example. I always made sure that there was a male-female teacher there when we studied this. But I like to use this example because he ran. And when he was running out, she tried to stop him by grabbing his cloak, and he just ran without his cloak. So I guess he ran out of the house in his underwear. So that's where we're going to pick up here on the next scripture. And she's seducing him, and this is what happens. So, Benji, do you mind picking up on that again?
Yeah. She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him the story. That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me, but as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did.
Can you imagine? So, Joseph, even though he acted godly and through no fault of his own, he finds himself in prison. Again, the light of the Lord is shining through him, and things start falling his way, and he's elevated in the position there. Just because we do things that are moral and right doesn't necessarily mean that we'll always avoid trouble or trauma. I think that's a part of life, and we're seeing that played out here. I think in many ways, we live on a battlefield. And regardless of the best laid plans we may have and our action, the enemy is out there with other ideas. So I think that that's, that's just kind of where we are. Now, I want to go on. While he's in prison, he runs into these two fellows who finds themselves in prison. They are two officials that work for Pharaoh. One is the baker, and the other is the royal cupbearer. And these are two very important positions. And I'm speculating here, but my speculation is that the positions are very important because a big deal back then with world leaders was finding themselves getting poisoned. So the people that handled the food and the wine were two very important people. They had to be very trustworthy. Now something happened where these two individuals did not follow the right protocol, and they were caught doing something they shouldn't have been doing, and they ended up in prison. So that's where we pick up here in verse 6:23, and I'll go ahead and read this. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house. "Why do you look so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, "In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." "This is what it means," Joseph said to him. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I've done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, "I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." "This is what it means," Joseph said. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh." Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that once again he put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. So, Joseph correctly interprets the dreams of his officials, these officials that were in prison. But he's unsuccessful in getting his own release. For now, that's right. So we see the story unfolds, this unfortunate delay that Joseph has. And we'll see the rest of the story. Of course, you know the rest of the story. He ultimately gets out of prison. But I can't help but think that the reason the cupbearer couldn't remember at the time about Joseph because it had to do with God's timing. So, with that in mind, what is your experience with God's timing? Do you have experience in that area?
I was talking to you earlier about that. Before I didn't know where this was going. I mean, right now I finished college and I'm working for you, but because of the paperwork and stuff, I don't know. You know, I had certain plans, and I think God's telling me, hold on. I might have a different timing for you, or you know, I know I have faith that things are gonna, you know, go as planned, as His plan. Just it's all about His timing. So I don't know. I'm just kind of like waiting on that right now.
For the benefit of the audience, tell a little bit about your situation.
Well, I'm an exchange student or I was an exchange student from Columbia, going to CCU, and I graduated, and I am currently trying to figure out how to stay in the U.S. Trying to do the paperwork, so tried through the company, and then I'm trying to do it through schooling, but nothing has quite fallen into place perfectly as it needs to in order for me to stay. So I've still got till June of next year, kind of like cleared on paper, but I don't know after that what's going on.
What we're learning here in working with Benji is that it's very, very difficult to get citizenship in the U.S. It's like a lottery. Any of you watching out there, if you have any connections with the State Department, please call, because we'd love to be able to get Benji citizenship and be able to keep him here in the country, because that's what he wants and that's what we want. But again, you know, we're talking about God's timing. Any other examples of God's timing for you, Ed, or Pastor Val? Have you ever been in a church where you're saying, I need to get out of this place and go to another church, and it doesn't happen, or anything like that that would relate to God's timing?
I think God's timing is perfect, and it's not always our timing, because I think as human beings, that human condition is we're tempted to say, no, I know exactly what the timing should be, and let me tell you, God, what that timing should be. and being patient is hard. Waiting is hard. It's difficult, because especially I can't imagine what it was like living in Joseph's society and culture 3,000, 4,000 years ago. But in our culture, we're used to everything immediate, you know, communication and everything. And so I think there is God's timing is perfect timing, and we are to learn about that. And we are supposed, as we're waiting, as we've lifted things up in prayer, whether it's in the life of the church or in our own personal lives, we have to wait on God's timing. We have to wait on God's timing, and that's difficult. And I know when I have waited upon God's timing, it's always better. It's always better, instead of, you know, where I just kind of forged ahead. Didn't always work out so well. I think that in the life of the church is crucial to commit to prayer things that we believe, you know, visions or goals that we feel God is leading us to. But if we don't pray over those, then I mean that always causes problems. We want to make sure that I want to make sure in the life of in the church, in the life of my life, that I'm waiting upon God to guide and direct me, instead of being all about me.
Any thoughts or experiences?
I don't think of any experiences, just the thoughts that I had kind of mirror what she was saying, that as humans, and I know especially myself, we're impatient. And we want everything immediate.
Yes.
That's not always the best thing.
Especially nowadays, that we want food, we go to the drive-through.
Yeah.
When I came to America, I found out that you guys have drive-through ATMs, and there's, you know, yeah, if you want money, drive in 10
Drive it and
minutes,
get it,
you
huh?
get it, and you want anything. Nowadays we have cars, so at least in the old days, if you wanted to go, it was like a month to go to Pennsylvania by horse. Now you just take a plane, and in 2 hours you're there.
Yep.
So we are in a world of instant gratification, which doesn't help.
I heard a sermon one time I thought was worth repeating. As an example, the pastor was talking about, driving at night. I mean, think in terms of, the headlights in the car. We can only see as far as those headlights will show us, and we can't see what's beyond that. And that's kind of the way God's timing is. He sees it all. We don't. We only see what's in front of us. And it's like, I want it now, God.
Well, and I think that I in my own life, I've learned that the hard way. It's like where, it's something, your way, I'm trying to think of an example, but it's, you've been wanting something and hoping for something and talking to God about something, and it either didn't turn out the way you thought it was going to, or it did. But especially when it doesn't turn out, it's like, and then maybe it's like 5 years later, you say, "Oh yeah, that's why. That's why."
Makes sense then.
Now it makes sense, because God put us in touch with somebody or in some situation, or got us a job that we wanted 20 years ago, or I don't know. But I think hindsight is always 20/20, because I think that's when it's like, that's why I was supposed to go here or go there, or that was why I was supposed to choose that job, or meet that person at lunch that pointed me in the direction of this job or this opportunity.
Let's go forward to the next phase of Joseph's life here, and we're going to go to.
I don't want to be the baker in that story, though. I can tell you that.
Well,
right now.
did you notice that's a couple weeks in a row now we've studied things that have people being impaled on poles?
Yes.
That's apparently a very common.
So where else was it? What
Isn't that what happened to him?
Oh yeah, he's. That was must be it was the
Popular choice
of
putting
getting
people
rid of
to death,
people. A lot of impaling here.
Chicken on a stick, beef on a stick. Why not humans
There you
on
go.
a stick too?
There you go.
All right. So, Ed, you mind reading this last section first here?
So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." "I cannot do it," Joseph replied to Pharaoh, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "In my dream I was standing on the bank of the Nile. When out of the river there came up 7 cows, fat and sleek, and they grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows came up, scrawny and very ugly and lean. I had never seen such ugly cows in all the land of Egypt. The lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that came up first. But even after they ate them, no one could tell that they had done so. They looked just as ugly as before. Then I woke up. In my dream, I saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads sprouted, withered and thin, and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 good heads. I told this to the magicians, but none of them could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in two forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man to put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take a fifth of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country, to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you."
So, how in the world? Look at what has happened here. There is a young man that has gone into slavery. And he's gone from being a slave to basically prime minister. I'm sure he had a different title. But it's, what we would understand as prime minister in this country in a fairly short period of time. How can this happen? Why does this happen?
God's favor is the only answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, what Joseph sets apart from others is extraordinary. I mean, it's just extraordinary. He's obviously a godly man, and he just ends up, just a total winner, in this part of the story. Now, this part of the story that we've seen tonight, this is only half of the Joseph story. It goes on. So I would encourage viewers to pick up the Bible and start with chapter 37 in Genesis and read the entire study, a story about Joseph, because it is a wonderful story. And I want to share with you one other person. If you excuse me just a second, because I have the book laying right out here. I'm going to grab it and bring it right back. There is this individual that I read about. I just happened to see this book advertised. And the book is called Be Free or Die. And I don't know if any of you have heard about this fellow by the name of Robert Smalls. Have you heard about him? You heard the name? Have you heard of him? I hadn't heard of him before. But here is an amazing young man. This Robert Smalls, he was born a slave back in the 1850s. And he, as a young boy, was seen as a very exceptional young boy. He was 11 years old. His master, he was in the household with his mother and the master. They were both domestic servants. And this particular house owner also, and he was in Charleston, South Carolina. But the owner of the house also had another house in Beaufort, South Carolina, which was near the port. And he spent most of his time in Beaufort. But he was so impressed with Robert Smalls that as a young boy, he took him away from his mother and made him a house servant in Beaufort. And Robert went on to start working on the ships that were in the port. He was farmed out as a worker on these ships. As he grew up, he got married, he had children, and the Civil War started. And Charleston was a real hotspot for the Civil War. And so Robert Smalls was experienced in, working on the ship and so forth. And he got the idea, and it's questionable whether he had the original idea or not, or whether he had the original idea or not. He was the one that orchestrated and ran with it. He had the idea that he could steal a ship out of that port and take his family and sail them to freedom. And that's what he did. He and several other of the slave workers on that ship, they got their families on that ship. And in the first sign of daybreak, it was, there's a lot to the story, how this all came together. But they sailed through, and he happened to have the captain's hat. He put on the captain's hat. He's tooting the horn. He's waving to all the, people along the shore. And it was very scary because, they would have been blown out of the water in a minute if anybody knew what was going on. But he sailed that steamer out, and he turned it over to the Union. He almost got blown out of the water by the Union because, he's got a rebel flag up there, right? So they're waving the white flag and so forth. So they managed to get to a Union port. This ship had a lot of armaments on it. So he sails this thing in, and he becomes so popular in the North. And there's a whole story about this. But he becomes so popular in the North. Everybody in the North knows who he is. Everybody in the South does too. They're gunning for him, as you can imagine. But ultimately, he is working for the Union Army throughout the war. He has many positions. He's invited to travel around and tell his story, and he becomes very, very famous. When he's working in these army positions, he's paid more than even most of the officers in the Union Army because they saw how talented he was. He ultimately became a congressman for South Carolina. And it's a wonderful story. And as I was reading this, the same time I was thinking about Joseph, I was thinking here is a contemporary example of a, Joseph type person. He didn't become in charge. He didn't become vice president, but he got us pretty darn far for, a person at that time in the country. So I just thought I'd share that too.
That's a cool story.
Yeah. Yes. All right. Well, that's all I have to talk about on Joseph. So what are we going to talk about next week?
Next week, we're going to dive into the Gospels, and we're going to look at Peter. We're going to talk about how he's a man of action. However, sometimes maybe he should, before he acts, maybe he ought to think a little bit. So we're going to look at that. We're going to look at just some different situations that he's in and take a look at it.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. So that should be a good discussion. Peter is a very interesting individual.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, good. All right, folks. Well, thank you very much for joining us. Look forward to having you all back next week, and we'll be studying Peter. So until next week, have a great week. Take care.